Section 00 of To the Last Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Kilmer. To the Last Man by Zane Grey. Forward. It was inevitable that in my efforts to write romantic history of the Great West, I should at length come to the story of a feud. For long I have steered clear of this rock, but at last I have reached it and must go over it, driven by my desire to chronicle the stirring events of pioneer days. Even today it is not possible to travel into the remote corners of the West without seeing the lives of people still affected by a fighting past. How can the truth be told about the pioneering of the West if the struggles, the fight, the blood be left out? It cannot be done. How can a novel be stirring and thrilling, as were those times, unless it be full of sensation? My long labors have been devoted to making stories resemble the times they depict. I have loved the West for its vastness, its contrast, its beauty and color and life, for its wildness and violence, and for the fact that I have seen how it developed great men and women who died unknown and unsung. In this materialistic age, this hard, practical, swift, greedy age of realism, it seems there is no place for writers of romance, no place for romance itself. For many years all the events leading up to the Great War were realistic, and the war itself was horribly realistic, and the aftermath is likewise. Romance is only another name for idealism, and I contend that life without ideals is not worth living. Never in the history of the world were ideals needed so terribly as now. Walter Scott wrote romance, so did Victor Hugo, and likewise Kipling, Hawthorne, Stevenson. It was Stevenson particularly who wielded a bludgeon against the realists. People live for the dream in their hearts, and I have yet to know anyone who has not some secret dream, some hope, however dim, some storied wall to look at in the dusk, some painted window leading to the soul. How strange indeed to find that the realists have ideals and dreams. To read them, one would think their lives held nothing significant. But they love, they hope, they dream, they sacrifice. They struggle on with that dream in their hearts just the same as others. We are all dreamers, if not in the heavy-lidded wasting of time, then in the meaning of life that makes us work on. It was Wordsworth who wrote, "The world is too much with us," and if I could give the secret of my ambition as a novelist in a few words, it would be contained in that quotation. My inspiration to write has always come from nature. Character and action are subordinated to setting. In all that I have done I have tried to make people see how the world is too much with them. Getting and spending, they lay waste their powers, with never a breath of the free and wonderful life of the open. So I come back to the main point of this foreword, in which I am trying to tell why and how I came to write the story of a feud notorious in Arizona as the Pleasant Valley War. Some years ago Mr. Henry Adams, a cattleman of Vermajo Park, New Mexico, told me that he had been in the Tonto Basin of Arizona and thought I might find interesting material there concerning this Pleasant Valley War. His version of the war between cattlemen and sheepmen certainly determined me to look over the ground. My old guide, Al Doyle of Flagstaff, had led me over half of Arizona, but never down into that wonderful wild and rugged basin between the Mogollon Mesa and the Mazatelles Mountains. Doyle had long lived on the frontier, and his version of the Pleasant Valley War differed markedly from that of Mr. Adams. I asked other old-timers about it, and their remarks further excited my curiosity. Once down there, Doyle and I found the wildest, most rugged, roughest, and most remarkable country either of us had visited, and the few inhabitants were like the country. I went in ostensibly to hunt bear and lion and turkey, but what I was really hunting for was the story of that Pleasant Valley War. I engaged the services of a bear hunter who had 3 strapping sons, as reserved and strange and aloof as he was. No wheel tracks of any kind had ever come within miles of their cabin. I spent 2 wonderful months hunting game and reveling in the beauty and grandeur of the Rim Rock country, but I came out knowing no more about the Pleasant Valley War. These Texans and their few neighbors, likewise from Texas, did not talk, but all I saw and felt only inspired me the more. This trip was in the fall of 1918. The next year I went again with the best horses, outfit, and men the Doyles could provide. At this time I did not ask any questions. But I rode horses, some of them too wild for me, and packed a rifle many 100 miles, riding sometimes 30 and 40 miles a day, and I climbed in and out of the deep canyons, desperately staying at the heels of one of those long-legged Texans. I learned the life of those backwoodsmen, but I did not get the story of the Pleasant Valley War. I had, however, won the friendship of that hardy people. In 1920 I went back with a still larger outfit, equipped to stay as long as I liked, and this time, without my asking it, different natives of the Tonto came to tell me about the Pleasant Valley War. No 2 of them agreed on anything concerning it, except that only one of the active participants survived the fighting. Whence comes my title, To the Last Man. Thus I was swamped in a mass of material out of which I could only flounder to my own conclusion. Some of the stories told me are singularly tempting to a novelist, but though I believe them myself, I cannot risk their improbability to those who have no idea of the wildness of wild men at a wild time. There really was a terrible and bloody feud, perhaps the most deadly and least known in all the annals of the West. I saw the ground, the cabins, the graves, all so darkly suggestive of what must have happened. I never learned the truth of the causes of the Pleasant Valley War, or if I did hear it, I had no means of recognizing it. All the given causes were plausible and convincing. Strange to state, there is still secrecy and reticence all over the Tonto Basin as to the facts of this feud. Many descendants of those killed are living there now, but no one likes to talk about it. Assuredly, many of the incidents told me really occurred, as for example, the terrible one of the 2 women, in the face of relentless enemies, saving the bodies of their dead husbands from being devoured by wild hogs. Suffice it to say that this romance is true to my conception of the war, and I base it upon the setting I learned to know and love so well, upon the strange passions of primitive people, and upon my instinctive reaction to the facts and rumors that I gathered. Zane Grey, Avalon, California, April 1921. End of foreword. Of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1, Part 1. At the end of a dry, uphill ride over barren country, Jean Isbel unpacked to camp at the edge of the cedars where a little rocky canyon, green with willow and cottonwood, promised water and grass. His animals were tired, especially the pack mule that had carried a heavy load, and with slow heave of relief they knelt and rolled in the dust. Jean experienced something of relief himself as he threw off his chaps. He had not been used to hot, dusty, glaring days on the barren lands. Stretching his long length beside a tiny rill of clear water that tinkled over the red stones, he drank thirstily. The water was cool, but it had an acrid taste, an alkali bite that he did not like. Not since he had left Oregon had he tasted clear, sweet, cold water, and he missed it just as he longed for the stately, shady forests he had loved. This wild, endless Arizona land bade fair to earn his hatred. By the time he had leisurely completed his tasks, twilight had fallen and coyotes had begun their barking. Jean listened to the yelps and to the moan of the cool wind in the cedars with a sense of satisfaction that these lonely sounds were familiar. This cedar wood burned into a pretty fire, and the smell of its smoke was newly pleasant. "Reckon maybe I'll learn to like Arizona," he mused half aloud. "But I've a hankering for waterfalls and dark green forests. Must be the Indian in me. Anyway, Dad needs me bad, and I reckon I'm here for keeps." Jean threw some cedar branches on the fire, in the light of which he opened his father's letter, hoping by repeated readings to grasp more of its strange portent. It had been 2 months in reaching him, coming by traveler, by stage and train, and then by boat, and finally by stage again. Written in lead pencil on a leaf torn from an old ledger, it would have been hard to read even if the writing had been more legible. "Dad's writing was always bad, but I never saw it so shaky," said Jean, thinking aloud. Grass Valley, Arizona. "Son, Jean, come home. Here is your home, and here you are needed. When we left Oregon we all reckoned you would not be long behind. But it's years now, and I'm growing old, son, and you was always my steadiest boy. Not that you ever was so damn steady. Only your wildness seemed more for the woods. You take after mother, and your brothers, Bill and Guy, take after me. That is the red and white of it. You're part Indian, Jean, and that Indian I reckon I'm going to need bad. I'm rich in cattle and horses, and my range here is the best I ever seen. Lately we have been losing stock, but that is not all nor so bad. Sheepmen had moved into the Tonto and are grazing down on Grass Valley. Cattlemen and sheepmen can never bide in this country. We have bad times ahead. Reckon I'll have more reason to worry and need you, but you must wait to hear that by word of mouth. Whatever you're doing, chuck it, and rustle for Grass Valley so to make here by spring. I am asking you to take pains to pack in some guns and a lot of shells, and hide them in your outfit. If you meet anyone when you are coming down into the Tonto, listen more than you talk. And last, son, don't let anything keep you in Oregon. Reckon you have a sweetheart, and if so, fetch her along. With love, from your dad, Jean Isbel. Jean pondered over this letter. Judged by memory of his father, who had always been self-sufficient, it had been a surprise and somewhat of a shock. Weeks of travel and reflection had not helped him to grasp the meaning between the lines. "Yes, Dad's growing old," mused Jean, feeling a warmth and a sadness stir in him. "He must be way over 60, but he never looked old. So he's rich now and losing stock and going to be sheeped off his range. Dad could stand a lot of rustling, but not much from sheepmen." The softness that stirred in Jean merged into a cold, thoughtful earnestness which had followed every perusal of his father's letter. A dark, full current seemed flowing in his veins, and at times he felt it swell and heat. It troubled him, making him conscious of a deeper, stronger self opposed to his careless, free, and dreamy nature. No ties had bound him in Oregon except love for the great, still forests and the thundering rivers, and this love came from his softer side. It had cost him a wrench to leave, and all the way by ship and down the coast to San Diego and across the Sierra Madres by stage, and so on to this last overland travel by horseback, he had felt a retreating of the self that was tranquil and happy, and a dominating of this unknown, somber self, with its menacing possibilities. Yet despite a nameless regret and a loyalty to Oregon, when he lay in his blankets he had to confess a keen interest in his adventurous future, a keen enjoyment
of this stark, wild Arizona. It appeared to be a different sky stretching in dark, star-spangled dome over him. Closer, vaster, bluer. The strong fragrance of sage and cedar floated over him with the campfire's smoke, and all seemed drowsily to subdue his thoughts. At dawn he rolled out of his blankets and, pulling on his boots, began the day with a zest for the work that must bring closer his calling future. White crackling frost and cold, nipping air were the same keen spurs to action that he had known in the uplands of Oregon, yet they were not wholly the same. He sensed an exhilaration similar to the effect of a strong, sweet wine. His horse and mule had fared well during the night, having been much refreshed by the grass and water of the little canyon. Jean mounted and rode into the cedars with gladness that at last he had put the endless leagues of barren land behind him. The trail he followed appeared to be seldom traveled. It led, accordingly to the meager information obtainable at the last settlement, directly to what was called the Rim, and from there Grass Valley could be seen down in the basin. The ascent of the ground was so gradual that only in long open stretches could it be seen. But the nature of the vegetation showed Jean how he was climbing. Scant, low, scraggly cedars gave place to more numerous, darker, greener, bushier ones, and these to high, full-foliaged, green-berried trees. Sage and grass in the open flats grew more luxuriously. Then came the pinyons, and presently, among them, the checkered-barked junipers. Jean hailed the first pine tree with a hearty slap on the brown, rugged bark. It was a small dwarf pine, struggling to live. The next one was larger, and after that came several, and beyond them pines stood up everywhere above the lower trees. Odor of pine needles mingled with the other dry smells that made the wind pleasant to Jean. In an hour from the first line of pines he had ridden beyond the cedars and pinyons into a slowly thickening and deepening forest. Underbrush appeared scarce except in ravines, and the ground in open patches held a bleached grass. Jean's eyes roved for sight of squirrels, birds, deer, or any moving creature. It appeared to be a dry, uninhabited forest. About midday Jean halted at a pond of surface water, evidently melted snow, and gave his animals a drink. He saw a few old deer tracks in the mud, and several huge bird tracks new to him, which he concluded must have been made by wild turkeys. The trail divided at this pond. Jean had no idea which branch he ought to take. "Reckon it doesn't matter," he muttered, as he was about to remount. His horse was standing with ears up, looking back along the trail. Then Jean heard a clip-clop of trotting hoofs, and presently espied a horseman. Jean made a pretense of tightening his saddle girths while he peered over his horse at the approaching rider. All men in this country were going to be of exceeding interest to Jean Isbel. This man at a distance rode and looked like all Arizonians Jean had seen. He had a superb seat in the saddle, and he was long and lean. He wore a huge black sombrero and a soiled red scarf. His vest was open, and he was without a coat. The rider came trotting up and halted several paces from Jean. "Hello, stranger," he said gruffly. "Howdy yourself," replied Jean. He felt an instinctive importance in the meeting with the man. Never had sharper eyes flashed over Jean and his outfit. He had a dust-colored, sunburned face, long, lean, and hard, a huge sandy mustache that hid his mouth, and eyes of piercing light intensity. Not very much hard Western experience had passed by this man. Yet he was not old, measured by years. When he dismounted, Jean saw he was tall, even for an Arizonian. "Seen your tracks back a ways," he said, as he slipped the bit to let his horse drink. "Where bound?" "Reckon I'm lost, all right," replied Jean. "New country for me." "Shore. I seen that from your tracks an' your last camp. Wal, where was you headed before you got lost?" The query was deliberately cool, with a dry, crisp ring. Jean felt the lack of friendliness or kindness in it. "Grass Valley. My name's Isbel," he replied, shortly. The rider attended to his drinking horse and presently rebridled him. Then, with long swing of leg, he appeared to step into the saddle. "Shore I knowed you was Jean Isbel," he said. "Everybody in the Tonto has heard old Gass Isbel sent for his boy." "Wal, then why did you ask?" inquired Jean, bluntly. "Reckon I wanted to see what you'd say." "So? All right. But I'm not carin' very much for what you say." Their glances locked steadily then, and each measured the other by the intangible conflict of spirit. "Shore that's natural," replied the rider. His speech was slow, and the motions of his long brown hands, as he took a cigarette from his vest, kept time with his words. "But seein' you're one of the Isbels, I'll have my say whether you want it or not. My name's Colter, an' I'm one of the sheepmen Gass Isbel's riled with." "Colter, glad to meet you," replied Jean. "An' I reckon who riled my father is goin' to rile me." "Shore. If that wasn't so you'd not be an Isbel," returned Colter, with a grim little laugh. "It's easy to see you ain't run into any Tonto Basin fellars yet. Wal, I'm goin' to tell you that your own man gabbed like a woman down at Greaves's store. Bragged about you an' how you could fight an' how you could shoot an' how you could track a horse or a man. Bragged how you'd chase every sheep herder back up on the Rim. I'm tellin' you because we want you to get our stand straight. We're goin' to run sheep down in Grass Valley." "Uh-huh. Wal, who's we?" queried Jean, curtly. "We at?" "We, I mean the sheepmen rangin' this Rim from Black Butte to the Apache country." "Colter, I'm a stranger in Arizona," said Jean, slowly. "I know little about ranchers or sheepmen. It's true my father sent for me. It's true, I dare say, that he bragged, for he was given to bluster and blow. And he's old now. I can't help it if he bragged about me. But if he has, and if he's justified in his stand against you sheepmen, I'm going to do my best to live up to his brag." "I get your hunch. Shore we understand each other, and that's a powerful help. You take my hunch to your old man," replied Colter, as he turned his horse away toward the left. "That trail leading south is yours. When you come to the Rim you'll see a bare spot down in the Basin. That'll be Grass Valley." He rode away out of sight into the woods. Jean leaned against his horse and pondered. It seemed difficult to be just to this Colter, not because of his claims, but because of a subtle hostility that emanated from him. Colter had the hard face, the masked intent, the turn of speech that Jean had come to associate with dishonest men. Even if Jean had not been prejudiced, if he had known nothing of his father's troubles with these sheepmen, and if Colter had met him only to exchange glances and greetings, still Jean would never have had a favorable impression. Colter, grated upon him, roused an antagonism seldom felt. "Hi ho!" sighed the young man. "Good bye to huntin' an' fishin'. Dad's given me a man's job." With that he mounted his horse and started the pack mule in the right hand trail. Walking and trotting, he traveled all afternoon, toward sunset getting into heavy forest of pine. More than one snow bank showed white through the green, sheltered on the north slopes of shady ravines, and it was upon entering this zone of richer, deeper forest land that Jean sloughed off his gloomy forebodings. These stately pines were not the giant firs of Oregon, but any lover of the woods could be happy under them. Higher still he climbed until the forest spread before and around him like a level park, with thicketed ravines here and there on each side, and presently that deceitful level led to a higher bench upon which the pines towered and were matched by beautiful trees he took for spruce. Heavily barked, with regular spreading branches, these conifers rose in symmetrical shape to spear the sky with silver plumes. A graceful gray-green moss waved like veils from the branches. The air was not so dry, and it was cooler, with a scent and touch of snow. Jean made his camp at the first likely site, taking the precaution to unroll his bed some little distance from his fire. Under the softly moaning pines he felt comfortable, having lost the sense of an immeasurable open space falling away from all around him. The gobbling of wild turkeys awakened Jean. Chug-a-lug, 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 chug. There was not a great difference between the gobble of a wild turkey and that of a tame one. Jean got up and, taking his rifle, went out into the gray obscurity of dawn to try to locate the turkeys. But it was too dark, and finally, when daylight came, they appeared to be gone. The mule had strayed, and, what with finding it and cooking breakfast and packing, Jean did not make a very early start. On this last lap of his journey he had slowed down. He was weary of hurrying. The change from weeks in the glaring sun and dust-laden wind to this sweet, cool, darkly green and brown forest was very welcome. He wanted to linger along the shaded trail. This day he made sure would see him reach the Rim. By and by he lost the trail. It had just worn out from lack of use. Every now and then Jean would cross an old trail, and as he penetrated deeper into the forest, every damp or dusky spot showed tracks of turkey, deer, and bear. The amount of bear signs surprised him. Presently his keen nostrils were assailed by the smell of sheep, and soon he rode into a broad sheep trail. From the tracks Jean calculated that the sheep had passed there the day before. An unreasonable antipathy seemed born in him. To be sure, he had been prepared to dislike sheep, and that was why he was unreasonable. But on the other hand, this band of sheep had left a broad, bare swath, weedless, grassless, flowerless, in their wake. Where sheep grazed, they destroyed. That was what Jean had against them. An hour later he rode to the crest of a long park-like slope, where new green grass was sprouting and flowers peeped everywhere. The pines appeared far apart. Gnarled oak trees showed rugged and gray against the green wall of woods. A white strip of snow gleamed like a moving stream away down in the woods. Jean heard the musical tinkle of bells and the baa baa of sheep and the faint, sweet bleating of lambs. As he rode toward these sounds, a dog ran out from an oak thicket and barked at him. Next Jean smelled a campfire, and soon he caught sight of a curling blue column of smoke, and then a small peaked tent. Beyond the clump of oaks Jean encountered a Mexican lad carrying a carbine. The boy had a swarthy, pleasant face, and to Jean's greeting he replied, "Buenos dias." Jean understood little Spanish, and about all he gathered by his simple queries was that the lad was not alone, and that it was lambing time. This latter circumstance grew noisily manifest. The forest seemed shrilly full of incessant baas and plaintive bleats. All about the camp, on the slope, in the glades, and everywhere were sheep. A few were grazing. Many were lying down. Most of them were ewes, suckling white, fleecy little lambs that staggered on their feet. Everywhere Jean saw tiny lambs just born. Their pinpointed bleats pierced the heavier baa baa of their mothers. End of chapter 1, part 1. Of
to the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1, Part 2. Jean dismounted and led his horse down toward the camp, where he rather expected to see another and older Mexican, from whom he might get information. The lad walked with him. Down this way the plaintive uproar made by the sheep was not so loud. "Hello there," called Jean cheerfully as he approached the tent. No answer was forthcoming. Dropping his bridle, he went on, rather slowly, looking for someone to appear. Then a voice from one side startled him. "Mawnin', stranger." A girl stepped out from beside a pine. She carried a rifle. Her face flashed richly brown, but she was not Mexican. This fact, and the sudden conviction that she had been watching him, somewhat disconcerted Jean. "Beg pardon, miss," he floundered. "Didn't expect to see a girl. I'm sort of lost, looking for the Rim, and thought I'd find a sheep herder who'd show me. I can't savvy this boy's lingo." While he spoke it seemed to him an intenseness of expression, a strain, relaxed from her face. A faint suggestion of hostility likewise disappeared. Jean was not sure that he had caught it, but there had been something that now was gone. "Shore I'd be glad to show you," she said. "Thanks, miss. Reckon I can breathe easy now," he replied. "It's a long ride from San Diego, hot and dusty. I'm pretty tired, and maybe this woods isn't good medicine to my aching eyes." "San Diego? You from the coast?" "Yes." Jean had doffed his sombrero at the sight of her, and he still held it, rather deferentially, perhaps. It seemed to attract her attention. "Put on your hat, stranger. Shore I can't recollect when any man bared his head to me." She uttered a little laugh in which surprise and frankness mingled with a tint of bitterness. Jean sat down with his back to a pine, and, laying the sombrero by his side, he looked full at her, conscious of a singular eagerness, as if he wanted to verify by close scrutiny a first hasty impression. If there had been an instinct in his meeting with Colter, there was more in this. The girl half sat, half leaned against a log, with a shiny little carbine across her knees. She had a level, curious gaze upon him, and Jean had never met one just like it. Her eyes were rather wide, oval in shape, clear and steady, with shadows of thought in their amber brown depths. They seemed to look through Jean, and his gaze dropped first. Then it was he saw her ragged homespun skirt and a few inches of brown bare ankles, strong and round, and crude worn-out moccasins that failed to hide the shapeliness of her feet. Suddenly she drew back her stockingless ankles and ill-shod little feet. When Jean lifted his gaze again he found her face half averted and a stain of red in the golden tan of her cheek. That touch of embarrassment somehow removed her from this strong, raw, wild woodland setting. It changed her poise. It detracted from the curious, unabashed, almost bold look that he had encountered in her eyes. "Reckon you're from Texas," said Jean, presently. "Shore am," she drawled. She had a lazy Southern voice, pleasant to hear. "How'd you all guess that?" "Anybody can tell a Texan. Where I came from there were a good many pioneers and ranchers from the old Lone Star State. I've worked for several. And, come to think of it, I'd rather hear a Texas girl talk than anybody." "Do you know many Texas girls?" she inquired, turning again to face him. "Reckon I did. Quite a good many." "Did you go with them?" "Go with them? Reckon you mean keep company." "Why, yes, I guess I did a little," laughed Jean. "Sometimes on a Sunday or a dance once in the blue moon an occasional ride." "Shore that accounts," said the girl wistfully. "For what?" asked Jean. "You being a gentleman," she replied, with force. "Oh, I've not forgotten. I had friends when we lived in Texas 3 years ago."
Shore it seems longer. 3 miserable years in this damned country." Then she bit her lip, evidently to keep back further unwitting utterance to a total stranger. And it was that biting of her lip that drew Jean's attention to her mouth. It held beauty of curve and fullness and color that could not hide a certain sadness and bitterness. Then the whole flashing brown face changed for Jean. He saw that it was young, full of passion and restraint, possessing a power which grew on him. This, with her shame and pathos, and the fact that she craved respect, gave a leap to Jean's interest. "Well, I reckon you flatter me," he said, hoping to put her at ease again. "I'm only a rough hunter and fisherman, wood chopper, and horse tracker. Never had all the school I needed, nor near enough company of nice girls like you." "Am I nice?" she asked quickly. "You shore are," he replied, smiling. "In these rags?" she demanded, with a sudden flash of passion that thrilled him. "Look at the holes." She showed rips and worn out places in the sleeves of her buckskin blouse, through which gleamed a round, brown arm. "I sew when I have anything to sew with. Look at my skirt, a dirty rag. And I have only one other to my name. Look." Again a color tinged her cheeks, most becoming, and giving the lie to her action. But shame could not check her violence now. A dammed up resentment seemed to have broken out in flood. She lifted the ragged skirt almost to her knees. "No stockings, no shoes. How can a girl be nice when she has no clean, decent women's clothes to wear?" "How can a girl " began Jean. "See here, miss, I'm beggin' your pardon for sort of stirrin' you to forget yourself a little. Reckon I understand. You don't meet many strangers an' I sort of hit you wrong, makin' you feel too much an' talk too much. Who an' what you are is none of my business. But we met, an' I reckon somethin' has happened, perhaps more to me than to you. Now let me put you straight about clothes an' women. Reckon I know most women love nice things to wear an' think because clothes make them look pretty that they're nicer or better. But they're wrong. You're wrong. Maybe it'd be too much for a girl like you to be happy without clothes. But you can be. You act just as nice an' fine, an' for all you know, a good deal more appealing to some men." "Stranger, you shore must excuse my temper an' the show I made of myself," replied the girl, with composure. "That, to say the least, was not nice. And I don't want anyone thinking better of me than I deserve. My mother died in Texas, and I've lived out here in this wild country, a girl alone among rough men. Meeting you today makes me see what a hard lot they are and what it's done to me." Jean smothered his curiosity and tried to put out of his mind a growing sense that he pitied her, liked her. "Are you a sheep herder?" he asked. "Shore I am, now and then. My father lives back here in a canyon. He's a sheepman. Lately there's been herders shot at. Just now we're short and I have to fill in. But I like sheep herdin' and I love the woods and the Rim Rock and all the Tonto. If they were all, I'd shore be happy." "Herders shot at!" exclaimed Jean, thoughtfully. "By whom? And what for?" "Trouble brewin' between the cattlemen down in the Basin and the sheepmen up on the Rim. Dad says there'll shore be hell to pay. I tell him I hope the cattlemen chase him back to Texas." "Then are you on the rancher's side?" queried Jean, trying to pretend casual interest. "No. I'll always be on my father's side," she replied with spirit. "But I'm bound to admit I think the cattlemen have the fair side of the argument." "How so?" "Because there's grass everywhere. I see no sense in a sheepman going out of his way to surround a cattleman and sheep off his range. That started the row. Lord knows how it'll end. For most all of them here are from Texas." "So I was told," replied Jean. "And I heard most all these Texans got run out of Texas. Any truth in that?" "Shore I reckon there is," she replied, seriously. "But, stranger, it might not be healthy for you to say that anywhere. My dad, for one, was not run out of Texas. Shore I never can see why he came heah. He's accumulated stock, but he's not so rich nor so well off as he was back home." "Are you going to stay here always?" queried Jean, suddenly. "If I do, so it'll be my grave," she answered, darkly. "But what's the use of thinking? People stay places until they drift away. You can never tell. Wal, stranger, this talk is keepin' you." She seemed moody now, and a note of detachment crept into her voice. Jean rose at once and went for his horse. If this girl did not desire to talk further, he certainly had no wish to annoy her. His mule had strayed off among the bleating sheep. Jean drove it back and then led his horse up to where the girl stood. She appeared taller and, though not of robust build, she was vigorous and lithe, with something about her that fitted the place. Jean was loath to bid her good by. "Which way is the Rim?" he asked, turning to his saddle girths. "South," she replied, pointing. "It's only a mile or so. I'll walk down with you. Suppose you're on your way to Grass Valley?" "Yes, I've relatives there," he returned. He dreaded her next question, which he suspected would concern his name, but she did not ask. Taking up her rifle, she turned away. Jean strode ahead to her side. "Reckon if you walk I won't ride." So he found himself beside a girl with the free step of a mountaineer. Her bare, brown head came up nearly to his shoulder. It was a small, pretty head, graceful, well held, and the thick hair on it was shiny, soft brown. She wore it in a braid, rather untidily and tangled, he thought, and it was tied with a string of buckskin. Altogether her apparel proclaimed poverty. Jean let the conversation languish for a little. He wanted to think what to say presently, and then he felt a rather vague pleasure in stalking beside her. Her profile was straight cut and exquisite in line. From this side view the soft curve of her lips could not be seen. She made several attempts to start conversation, all of which Jean ignored, manifestly to her growing constraint. Presently Jean, having decided what he wanted to say, suddenly began: "I like this adventure. Do you?" "Adventure? Meeting me in the woods?" And she laughed the laugh of youth. "Shore you must be hard up for adventure, stranger." "Do you like it?" he persisted, and his eyes searched the half averted face. "I might like it," she answered, frankly, "if my temper had not made a fool of me. I never meet any one I care to talk to. Why should it not be pleasant to run across some one new, some one strange in this heah wild country?" "We are as we are," said Jean, simply. "I didn't think you made a fool of yourself. If I thought so, would I want to see you again?" "Do you?" The brown face flashed on him with surprise, with a light he took for gladness. And because he wanted to appear calm and friendly, not too eager, he had to deny himself the thrill of meeting those changing eyes. "Shore I do. Reckon I'm overbold on such short acquaintance. But I might not have another chance to tell you. So please don't hold it against me." This declaration over, Jean felt relief and something of exultation. He had been afraid he might not have the courage to make it. She walked on as before, only with her head bowed a little and her eyes downcast. No color but the gold brown tan and the blue tracery of veins showed in her cheeks. He noticed then a slight swelling quiver of her throat, and he became alive to its graceful contour, and to how full and pulsating it was, how nobly it set into the curve of her shoulder. Here in her quivering throat was the weakness of her, the evidence of her sex, the womanliness that belied the mountaineer's stride and the strong grasp of brown hands on a rifle. It had an effect on Jean totally inexplicable to him, both in the strange warmth that stole over him and in the utterance he could not hold back. "Girl, we're strangers. But what of that? We've met, and I tell you it means something to me. I've known girls for months and never felt this way. I don't know who you are. I don't care. You betrayed a good deal to me. You're not happy. You're lonely. And if I didn't want to see you again for my own sake, I would for yours. Some things you said I'll not forget soon. I've got a sister, and I know you have no brother, and I reckon—" At this juncture Jean, in his earnestness, and quite without thought, grasped her hand. The contact checked the flow of his speech and suddenly made him aghast at his temerity. But the girl did not make any effort to withdraw it, so Jean, inhaling a deep breath and trying to see through his bewilderment, held on bravely. He imagined he felt a faint warm, returning pressure. She was young, she was friendless, she was human. By this hand in his Jean felt more than ever the loneliness of her. Then, just as he was about to speak again, she pulled her hand free. "Here's the Rim," she said, in her quaint Southern drawl. "And there's your Tonto Basin." Jean had been intent only upon the girl. He had kept step beside her without taking note of what was ahead of him. At her words he looked up expectantly, to be struck mute. He felt a sheer force, a downward drawing of an immense abyss beneath him. As he looked afar he saw a black basin of timbered country, the darkest and wildest he had ever gazed upon, 100 miles of blue distance across to an unflung mountain range, hazy purple against the sky. It seemed to be a stupendous gulf, surrounded on 3 sides by bold, undulating lines of peaks, and on his side by a wall so high that he felt lifted aloft on the run of the sky. "Southeast you see the Sierra Anchas," said the girl, pointing. "That notch in the range is the pass where sheep are driven to Phoenix and Maricopa. Those big rough mountains to the south are the Mazatals. Round to the west is the Four Peaks Range. And you're standing on the Rim." Jean could not see at first just what the Rim was, but by shifting his gaze westward he grasped this remarkable phenomenon of nature. For leagues and leagues a colossal red and yellow wall, a rampart, a mountain-faced cliff, seemed to zigzag westward. Grand and bold were the promontories reaching out over the void. They ran toward the westering sun. Sweeping and impressive were the long lines slanting away from them, sloping darkly, spotted down to merge into the black timber. Jean had never seen such a wild and rugged manifestation of nature's depths and upheavals. He was held mute. "Stranger, look down," said the girl. Jean's sight was educated to judge heights and depths and distances. This wall upon which he stood sheered precipitously down, so far that it made him dizzy to look, and then the craggy broken cliffs merged into red-sided, cedar-greened slopes running down and down into gorges choked with forests, and from which soared up a roar of rushing waters. Slope after slope, ridge beyond ridge, canyon merging into canyon, so the tremendous bowl sunk away to its black, deceiving depths, a wilderness across which travel seemed impossible. "Wonderful!" exclaimed Jean. "Indeed it is," murmured the girl. "Shore that is Arizona. I reckon I love this. The heights and depths, the awfulness of its wilderness." "And you want to leave it?" "Yes and no. I don't deny the peace that comes to me here. But not often do I see the Basin, and for that matter one doesn't live on grand scenery." "Child, even once in a while this sight would cure any misery if you only see. I'm glad I came. I'm glad you showed it to me first." She too seemed under the spell of a vastness and loneliness and beauty and grandeur that could not but strike the heart. Jean took her hand again. "Girl, say you will meet me here," he said, his voice ringing deep in his ears. "Shore I will," she replied softly, and turned to him. It seemed then that Jean saw her face for the first time. She was beautiful as he had never known beauty. Limned against that scene, she gave it life, wild, sweet, young life, the poignant meaning of which haunted yet eluded him. But she belonged there. Her eyes were again searching his, as if for some lost part of herself, unrealized, never known before, wondering, wistful, hopeful, glad they were eyes that seemed surprised to reveal part of her soul. Then her red lips parted. Their tremulous movement was a magnet to Jean. An invisible and mighty force pulled him down to kiss them. Whatever the spell had been, that rude, unconscious action broke it. He jerked away, as if he expected to be struck. "Girl, he gasped in amazed and sudden dawning contrition. "I kissed you, but I swear it wasn't intentional. I never thought." The anger that Jean anticipated failed to materialize. He stood breathing hard, with a hand held out in unconscious appeal. By the same magic, perhaps, that had transfigured her a moment past, she was now invested again by the older character. "Shore I reckon my callin' you a gentleman was a little previous," she said, with a rather dry bitterness. "But, stranger, you're sudden." "You're not insulted?" asked Jean, hurriedly. "Oh, I've been kissed before. Shore men are all alike." "They're not," he replied, hotly, with a sudden rush of disillusion, a dulling of enchantment. "Don't you class me with other men who've kissed you. I wasn't myself when I did it, and I'd have gone on my knees to ask your forgiveness. But now I wouldn't. And I wouldn't kiss you again either, even if you wanted it." Jean read in her strange gaze what seemed to him a vague doubt, as if she was questioning him. "Miss, I take that back," added Jean, shortly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be rude. It was a mean trick for me to kiss you a girl alone in the woods who's gone out of her way to be kind to me. I don't know why I forgot my manners, and I ask your pardon." She looked away then, and presently pointed far out and down into the Basin. "There's Grass Valley, that long gray spot in the black. It's about 15 miles. Ride along the Rim that way till you cross a trail. Shore you can't miss it. Then go down." "I'm much obliged to you," replied Jean, reluctantly accepting what he regarded as his dismissal. Turning his horse, he put his foot in the stirrup, then, hesitating, looked across the saddle at the girl. Her abstraction, as she gazed away over the purple depths, suggested loneliness and wistfulness. She was not thinking of that scene spread so wondrously before her. It struck Jean that she might be pondering a subtle change in his feeling and attitude, something he was conscious of yet could not define. "Reckon this is good by," he said, with hesitation. "Adios, senor," she replied, facing him again. She lifted the little carbine to the hollow of her elbow and, half turning, appeared ready to depart. "Adios means good by?" he queried. "Yes, good by till to morrow or good by forever. Take it as you like." "Then you'll meet me here day after to morrow?" How eagerly he spoke on impulse, without consideration of the intangible thing that had changed him. "Did I say I wouldn't?" "No, but I reckoned you'd not care to after," he replied, breaking off in some confusion. "Shore I'll be glad to meet you day after to morrow about mid afternoon, right here. Fetch all the news from Grass Valley." "All right. Thanks. That'll be fine," replied Jean, and as he spoke he experienced a buoyant thrill, a pleasant lightness of enthusiasm, such as always stirred boyishly in him at a prospect of adventure. Before it passed he wondered at it and felt unsure of himself. He needed to think. "Stranger, shore I'm not recollectin' that you've told me who you are," she said. "No, I reckon I didn't tell you," he returned. "What difference does that make? I said I didn't care who or what you are. Can't you feel the same about me?" "Sure I felt that way," she replied, somewhat nonplussed, with the level brown gaze steadily on his face. "But now you make me think." "Let's meet without knowing any more about each other than we do now." "Shore I'd like that. In this big wild Arizona a girl an' I reckon a man feel so insignificant. What's a name, anyhow? Still, people an' things have to be distinguished. I'll call you stranger an' be satisfied if you say it's fair for you not to tell me who you are." "Fair? No, it's not," declared Jean, forced to confession. "My name is Jean Isbel." "Isbel!" she exclaimed, with a violent start. "Shore you can't be the son of old Gass Isbel. I've seen both his sons." "He has three," replied Jean, with relief. Now the secret was out. "I'm the youngest. I'm 24. Never been out of Oregon till now. On my way." The brown color slowly faded out of her face, leaving her quite pale, with eyes that began to blaze. The suppleness of her seemed to stiffen. "My name's Ellen Jorth," she burst out, passionately. "Does it mean anything to you?" "Never heard it in my life," protested Jean. "Shore I reckon you belong to the sheep raisers who were on the outs with my father. That's why I had to tell you that I'm Jean Isbel. Ellen Jorth, it's strange an' pretty. Reckon I can be just as good a friend to you." "No Isbel can ever be a friend to me," she said, with bitter coldness. Stripped of her ease and her soft wistfulness, she stood before him one instant entirely another girl, a hostile enemy. Then she wheeled and strode off into the woods. Jean, in amaze, in consternation, watched her swiftly draw away with her lithe, free step, wanting to follow her, wanting to call her. But the resentment roused by her suddenly avowed hostility held him mute in his tracks. He watched her disappear, and when the brown and green wall of forest swallowed the slender gray form he fought against the insistent desire to follow her, and fought in vain. End of chapter 1, part 2.
Of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, Part 1. But Ellen Jorth's moccasined feet did not leave a distinguishable trail on the springing pine needles covering the ground, and Jean could not find any trace of her. A little futile searching to and fro cooled his impulse and called pride to his rescue. Returning to his horse, he mounted, rode out behind the pack mule to start it along, and soon felt the relief of decision and action. Clumps of small pines grew thickly in spots on the rim, making it necessary for him to skirt them, at which times he lost sight of the purple basin. Every time he came back to an opening through which he could see the wild ruggedness and colors and distances, his appreciation of their nature grew on him. Arizona, from Yuma to the Little Colorado, had been to him an endless waste of wind-scoured, sun-blasted barrenness. This black forested, rock-rimmed land of untrodden ways was a world that in itself would satisfy him. Some instinct in Jean called for a lonely, wild land into the fastness of which he could roam at will and be the other strange self that he had always yearned to be but had never been. Every few moments there intruded into his flowing consciousness the flashing face of Ellen Jorth, the way she had looked at him, the things she had said. "Reckon I was a fool," he soliloquized, with an acute sense of humiliation. "She never saw how much in earnest I was." And Jean began to remember the circumstances with a vividness that disturbed and perplexed him. The accident of running across such a girl in that lonely place might be out of the ordinary, but it had happened. Surprise had made him dull. The charm of her appearance,
The appeal of her manner must have drawn him at the very first, but he had not recognized that. Only at her words, "Oh, I've been kissed before," had his feelings been checked in their heedless progress. And the utterance of them had made a difference he now sought to analyze. Some personality in him, some voice, some idea, had begun to defend her even before he was conscious that he had arraigned her before the bar of his judgment. Such defense seemed clamoring in him now, and he forced himself to listen. He wanted, in his hurt pride, to justify his amazing surrender to a sweet and sentimental impulse. He realized now at first glance that he should have recognized in her look, her poise, her voice, the quality he called thoroughbred. Ragged and stained apparel did not prove her of a common sort. Jean had known a number of fine and wholesome girls of good family, and he remembered his sister. This Ellen Jorth was that kind of girl, irrespective of her present environment. Jean championed her loyally, even after he had gratified his selfish pride. It was then, contending with an intangible and stealing glamour, unreal and fanciful, like the dream of a forbidden enchantment, that Jean arrived at the part in the little woodland drama where he had kissed Ellen Jorth and had been unrebuked. Why had she not resented his action? Dispelled was the illusion he had been dreamily and nobly constructing. "Oh, I've been kissed before." The shock to him now exceeded his first dismay. Half bitterly she had spoken, and wholly scornful of herself, or of him, or of all men. For she had said all men were alike. Jean chafed under the smart that, a taunt every decent man hated. Naturally, every happy and healthy young man would want to kiss such red, sweet lips. But if those lips had been for others, never for him. Jean reflected that not since childish games had he kissed a girl, until this brown-faced Ellen Jorth came his way. He wondered at it. Moreover, he wondered at the significance he placed upon it. After all, was it not merely an accident? Why should he remember? Why should he ponder? What was the faint, deep, growing thrill that accompanied some of his thoughts? Riding along with a busy mind, Jean almost crossed a well-beaten trail leading through a pine thicket and down over the Rim. Jean's pack mule led the way without being driven. And when Jean reached the edge of the bluff, one look down was enough to fetch him off his horse. That trail was steep, narrow, clogged with stones, and as full of sharp corners as a cross-cut saw. Once on the descent, with a packed mule and a spirited horse, Jean had no time for mind wanderings and very little for occasional glimpses out over the cedar tops to the vast blue hollow asleep under a westering sun. The stones rattled, the dust rose, the cedar twigs snapped, the little avalanches of red earth slid down. Iron-shod hoofs rang on the rocks. This slope had been narrow at the apex in the Rim, where the trail led down a crack, and it widened in fan shape as Jean descended. He zigzagged down 1,000 feet before the slope benched into dividing ridges. Here the cedars and junipers failed, and pines once more hid the sun. Deep ravines were black with brush. From somewhere rose a roar of running water, most pleasant to Jean's ears. Fresh deer and bear tracks covered old ones made in the trail. Those timbered ridges were but billows of that tremendous slope that now sheered above Jean, ending in a magnificent yellow wall of rock, greened in niches, stained by weather rust, carved and cracked and caverned. As Jean descended further, the hum of bees made melody. The roar of rapid water and the murmur of rising breeze filled him with the content of the wild. Sheepmen like Colter and wild girls like Ellen Jorth and all that seemed promising or menacing in his father's letter could never change the Indian in Jean. So he thought. Hard upon that conclusion rushed another, one which troubled with its stinging revelation. Surely these influences he had defied were just the ones to bring out in him the Indian he had sensed but had never known. The eventful day had brought new and bitter food for Jean to reflect upon. The trail landed him in a boulder strewn bed of a wide canyon, where the huge trees stretched a canopy of foliage which denied the sunlight, and where a beautiful brook rushed and foamed. Here at last Jean tasted water that rivaled his Oregon springs. "Ah!" he cried. "That sure is good." Dark and shaded and ferny and mossy was the streamway, and everywhere were tracks of game, from the giant spread of a grizzly bear to the tiny bird-like imprints of a squirrel. Jean heard familiar sounds of deer crackling the dead twigs, and the chatter of squirrels was incessant. This fragrant, cool retreat under the Rim brought back to him the dim recesses of Oregon forests. After all, Jean felt that he would not miss anything that he had loved in the Cascades. But what was the vague sense of all not being well with him, the essence of faint regret, the insistence of a hovering shadow? And then flashed again, etched more vividly by the repetition in memory, a picture of eyes, of lips, of something he had to forget. Wild and broken as this rolling basin floor had appeared to him from the Rim, the reality of traveling over it made that first impression a deceit of distance. Down here all was on a big, rough, broken scale. Jean did not find even a few rods of level ground. Boulders as huge as houses obstructed the stream bed. Spruce trees 8 feet thick tried to lord it over the brawny pines. The ravine was a veritable canyon, from which occasional glimpses through the foliage showed the Rim as a lofty, red-tipped mountain peak. Jean's pack mule became frightened at the scent of a bear or a lion and ran off down the rough trail, imperiling Jean's outfit. It was not an easy task to head him off, nor, when that was accomplished, to keep him to a trot. But his fright and succeeding skittishness at least made for fast traveling. Jean calculated that he covered 10 miles under the Rim before the character of ground and forest began to change. The trail had turned southeast. Instead of gorge after gorge, red-walled and choked with forest, there began to be rolling ridges, some high, others were knolls, and a thick cedar growth made up for the falling off of pine. The spruce had long disappeared. Juniper thickets gave way more and more to the beautiful manzanita, and soon on the south slopes appeared cactus and a scrubby live oak. But for the well-broken trail, Jean would have fared ill through this tough brush. Jean espied several deer, and again a coyote, and what he took to be a small herd of wild horses. No more turkey tracks showed in the dusty patches. He crossed a number of tiny brooklets, and at length came to a place where the trail ended or merged in a rough road that showed evidence of considerable travel. Horses and sheep and cattle had passed along there that day. The road turned southward, and Jean began to have pleasurable expectations. The road, like the trail, led down grade, but no longer at such steep angles, and was bordered by cedar and pinyon, jack pine and juniper, mescal and manzanita. Quite sharply, going round a ridge, the road led Jean's eye down to a small open flat of marshy or at least grassy ground. The green oasis in the wilderness of red and timbered ridges marked another change in the character of the Basin. Beyond that country began to spread out and roll gracefully its dark green forest interspersed with grassy parks, until Jean headed into a long, wide, gray-green valley surrounded by black-fringed hills. His pulse quickened here. He saw cattle dotting the expanse, and here and there along the edge log cabins and corrals. As a village, Grass Valley could not boast of much, apparently, in the way of population. Cabins and houses were widely scattered, as if the inhabitants did not care to encroach upon one another. But the one store, built of stone, and stamped also with the characteristic isolation, seemed to Jean to be a rather remarkable edifice. Not exactly like a fort did it strike him, but if it had not been designed for defense, it certainly gave that impression, especially from the long, low side, with its dark eye-like windows about the height of a man's shoulder. Some rather fine horses were tied to a hitching rail. Otherwise, dust and dirt and age and long use stamped this Grass Valley store and its immediate environment. Jean threw his bridle and, getting down, mounted the low porch and stepped into the wide open door. A face, gray against the background of gloom inside, passed out of sight just as Jean entered. He knew he had been seen. In front of the long, rather low-ceilinged store were four men, all absorbed apparently in a game of checkers. Two were playing and two were looking on. One of these, a gaunt-faced man past middle age, casually looked up as Jean entered. But the moment of that casual glance afforded Jean time enough to meet eyes he instinctively distrusted. They masked their penetration. They seemed neither curious nor friendly. They saw him as if he had been merely thin air. "Good evening," said Jean. After what appeared to Jean a lapse of time sufficient to impress him with the possible deafness of these men, the gaunt-faced one said, "Howdy, Isbel." The tone was impersonal, dry, easy, cool, laconic, and yet it could not have been more pregnant with meaning. Jean's sharp sensibilities absorbed much. None of the slouched sombreroed, long mustached Texans, for so Jean at once classed them, had ever seen Jean, but they knew him and knew that he was expected in Grass Valley. All but the one who had spoken happened to have their faces in shadow under the wide-brimmed black hats. Motley garbed, gun-belted, dusty booted, they gave Jean the same impression of latent force that he had encountered in Colter. "Will somebody please tell me where to find my father, Gaston Isbel?" inquired Jean, with as civil a tongue as he could command. Nobody paid the slightest attention. It was the same as if Jean had not spoken. Waiting, half amused, half irritated, Jean shot a rapid glance around the store. The place had felt bare, and Jean, peering back through the gloomy space, saw that it did not contain much. Dry goods and sacks littered a long, rude counter. Long, rough shelves divided their length into stacks of canned foods and empty sections. A low shelf back of the counter held a generous burden of cartridge boxes, and next to it stood a rack of rifles. On the counter lay open cases of plug tobacco, the odor of which was second in strength only to that of rum. Jean's swift roving eye reverted to the men, three of whom were absorbed in the greasy checkerboard. The fourth man was the one who had spoken, and he now deigned to look at Jean. Not much flesh was there stretched over his bony, powerful physiognomy. He stroked the lean chin with a big, mobile hand that suggested more of bridle holding than familiarity with bucksaw and plow handle. It was a lazy hand. The man looked lazy. If he spoke at all, it would be with lazy speech. Yet Jean had not encountered many men to whom he would have accorded more potency to stir in him the instinct of self-preservation. "Shore," drawled this gaunt-faced Texan. "Old Gas lives about a mile down here." With a slow sweep of the big hand he indicated a general direction to the south. Then, appearing to forget his questioner, he turned his attention to the game. Jean muttered his thanks, and striding out, he mounted again and drove the pack mule down the road. "Reckon I've run into the wrong folds to day," he said. If I remember Dad right, he was a man to make and keep friends. Somehow I'll bet there's going to be hell." Beyond the store were some rather pretty and comfortable homes, little ranch houses back in the coves of the hills. The road turned west and Jean saw his first sunset in the Tonto Basin. It was a pageant of purple clouds with silver edges and background of deep, rich gold. Presently Jean met a lad driving a cow. "Hello, Johnny," he said genially, and with a double purpose. "My name's Jean Isbel. By golly, I'm lost in Grass Valley. Will you tell me where my dad lives?" "Yep. Keep right on. You can't miss him," replied the lad, with a bright smile. "He's lookin' for you." "How do you know, boy?" queried Jean, warmed by that smile. "Aw, I know. It's all over the valley that you'd ride in to day. Shore I was the one that told your dad, an' he give me $1." "Was he glad to hear it?" asked Jean, with a queer sensation in his throat. "Wal, he plumb was." "An' who told you that I was goin' to ride in to day?" "I heard it at the store," replied the lad, with an air of confidence. "Some sheepmen were talkin' to Greaves. He's the storekeeper." "I was settin' outside, but I heard. A Mexican came down off the Rim to day an' fetched the news." Here the lad looked furtively around, then whispered: "An' that greaser was sent by somebody. I never heard no more, but them sheepmen looked pretty plumb sour. An' one of them comin' out give me a kick, darn him! It shore is the luckiest day for us cowmen." "How's that, Johnny?" "Wal, thar's shore a big fight comin' to Grass Valley. My dad says so, an' he rides for your dad. An' if it comes now you'll be heah." "Ahuh!" laughed Jean. "An' what then, boy?" The lad turned bright eyes upward. "Aw, now, you cain't come thet on me. Ain't you an Injun, Jean Isbel? Ain't you a hoss tracker thet rustlers can't fool? Ain't you a plumb dead shot? Ain't you wrestled a grizzly bear in a rough an' tumble? Now ain't you, shore?" Jean bade the flattering lad a rather somber good day and rode on his way. Manifestly a reputation somewhat difficult to live up to had preceded his entry into Grass Valley. End of Chapter 2, Part 1. To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, Part 2. Jean's first sight of his future home thrilled him through. It was a big, low, rambling log structure standing well out from a wooded knoll at the edge of the valley. Corrals and barns and sheds lay off at the back. To the fore stretched broad pastures where numberless cattle and horses grazed. At sunset the scene was one of rich color. Prosperity and abundance and peace seemed attendant upon that ranch. Lusty voices of burros braying and cows bawling seemed welcoming Jean. A hound bayed. The first cool touch of wind fanned Jean's cheek and brought a fragrance of wood smoke and frying ham. Horses in the pasture romped to the fence and whistled at these newcomers. Jean espied a white-faced black horse that gladdened his sight. "Hello, Whiteface. I'll shore straddle you," called Jean. Then up the gentle slope he saw the tall figure of his father, the same as he had seen him thousands of times, bareheaded, shirt-sleeved, striding with long step. Jean waved and called to him. "Hi, you prodigal," came the answer. Yes, the voice of his father, and Jean's boyhood memories flashed. He hurried his horse those last few rods. No, Dad was not the same. His hair shone gray. "Here I am, Dad," called Jean, and then he was dismounting. A deep, quiet emotion settled over him, stilling the hurry, the eagerness, the pang in his breast. "Son, "I shore am glad to see you," said his father, and wrung his hand. "Well, well, the size of you! Shore you've grown. And how you favor your mother!" Jean felt in the iron clasp of hand, in the uplifting of the handsome head, in the strong, fine light of piercing eyes, that there was no difference in the spirit of his father. But the old smile could not hide lines and shades strange to Jean. "Dad, I'm as glad as you," replied Jean, heartily. "It seems long we've been parted, now I see you. Are you well, Dad, and all right?" "No complaining, son. I can ride all day, same as ever," he said. "Come, never mind your horses. They'll be looked after. Come meet the folks. Well, well, you got here at last." On the porch of the house a group awaited Jean's coming, rather silently, he thought. Wide eyed children were there, very shy and watchful. The dark face of his sister corresponded with the image of her in his memory. She appeared taller, more womanly as she embraced him. "Oh, Jean, Jean, I'm glad you've come," she cried, and pressed him close. Jean felt in her womanly anxiety for the present as well as affection for the past. He remembered his Aunt Mary, though he had not seen her for years. His half brothers, Bill and Guy, had changed little except perhaps to grow lean and rangy. Bill resembled his father, though his aspect was jocular rather than serious. Guy was smaller, wiry, and hard as rock, with snapping eyes and a brown, still face, and he had the bow legs of a cattleman. Both had married in Arizona. Bill's wife, Kate, was a stout, comely little woman, mother of 3 children. The other wife was young, a strapping girl, red-headed and freckled, with wonderful lines of pain and strength in her face. Jean remembered, as he looked at her, that someone had written him about the tragedy in her life. When she was only a child the Apaches had murdered all her family. The next to greet Jean were the little children, all shy, yet all manifestly impressed by the occasion. A warmth and intimacy of forgotten home emotions flooded over Jean. Sweet it was to get home to these relatives who loved him and welcomed him with quiet gladness. But there seemed more. Jean was quick to see the shadow in the eyes of the women in that household and to sense a strange reliance which his presence brought. "Son, this here Tonto is a land of milk and honey," said his father, as Jean gazed spellbound at the bounteous supper. Jean certainly performed gastronomic feats on this occasion, to the delight of Aunt Mary and the wonder of the children. "Oh, he's starved to death," whispered one of the little boys to his sister. They had begun to warm to this stranger uncle. Jean had no chance to talk, even if he had been able to, for the mealtime showed a relaxation of restraint, and they all tried to tell him things at once. In the bright lamplight his father looked easier and happier as he beamed upon Jean. After supper the men went into an adjoining room that appeared most comfortable and attractive. It was long and the width of the house, with a huge stone fireplace, low ceiling of hewn timbers, and walls of the same. Small windows with inside shutters of wood, and homemade table and chairs and rugs. "Well, Jean, do you recollect those shooting irons?" inquired the rancher, pointing above the fireplace. 2 guns hung on the spreading deer antlers there. One was a musket Jean's father had used in the war of the rebellion, and the other was a long, heavy, muzzle-loading flintlock Kentucky rifle, with which Jean had learned to shoot. "Reckon I do, Dad," replied Jean, and with reverent hands and a rush of memory he took the old gun down. "Jean, you shore handle that old arm some clumsy," said Guy Isbel, dryly. And Bill added a remark to the effect that perhaps Jean had been leading a luxurious and tame life back there in Oregon, and then added, "But I reckon he's packing that 6-shooter like a Texan." "Say, I fetched a gun or two along with me," replied Jean, jocularly. Reckon I near broke my poor mule's back with the load of shells and guns. Dad, what was the idea of askin' me to pack out an arsenal?" "Son, shore all shootin' arms an' such are at a premium in the Tonto," replied his father. "An' I was givin' you a hunch to come loaded." His cool, drawling voice seemed to put a damper upon the pleasantries. Right there Jean sensed the charged atmosphere. His brothers were bursting with utterance about to break forth, and his father suddenly wore a look that recalled to Jean critical times of days long past. But the entrance of the children and the women folk put an end to confidences. Evidently the youngsters were laboring under subdued excitement. They preceded their mother, the smallest boy in the lead. For him this must have been both a dreadful and wonderful experience, for he seemed to be pushed forward by his sister and brother and mother and driven by yearnings of his own. "There now, Lee. Say, Uncle Jean, what did you fetch us?" The lad hesitated for a shy, frightened look at Jean, and then, gaining something from his scrutiny of his uncle, he toddled forward and bravely delivered the question of tremendous importance. "What did I fetch you? Hey?" cried Jean in delight as he took the lad upon his knee. "Wouldn't you like to know? I didn't forget, Lee. I remembered you all. Oh, the job I had packing your bundle of presents! Now, Lee, make a guess." "I dess you fetched a dun," replied Lee. "A dun? I'll bet you mean a gun," laughed Jean. "Well, you 4-year-old Texas gunman, make another guess." That appeared too momentous and entrancing for the other two youngsters, and adding their shrill and joyous voices to Lee's, they besieged Jean. "Dad, where's my pack?" cried Jean. "These young Apaches are after my scalp." "Reckon the boys fetched it on to the porch," replied the rancher. Guy Isbel opened the door and went out. "By golly, here's 3 packs," he called. "Which one do you want, Jean?" "It's a long, heavy bundle, all tied up," replied Jean. Guy came staggering in under a burden that brought a whoop from the youngsters and bright gleams to the eyes of the women. Jean lost nothing of this. How glad he was that he had tarried in San Francisco because of a mental picture of this very reception in far off, wild Arizona. When Guy deposited the bundle on the floor it jarred the room. It gave forth metallic and rattling and crackling sounds. "Everybody stand back and give me elbow room," ordered Jean, majestically. "My good folks, I want you all to know that this is something that doesn't happen often. The bundle you see here weighed about 100 pounds when I packed it on my shoulder down Market Street in Frisco. It was stolen from me on shipboard. I got it back in San Diego and licked the thief. It rode on a burro from San Diego to Yuma, and once I thought the burro was lost for keeps. It came up the Colorado River from Yuma to Ehrenberg, and there went on top of a stage. We got chased by bandits, and once when the horses were galloping hard it near rolled off. Then it went on the back of a pack horse and helped wear him out. And I reckon it would be somewhere else now if I hadn't fallen in with a freighter going north from Phoenix to the Santa Fe Trail. The last lap, when it sagged the back of a mule, was the riskiest and full of the narrowest escapes. Twice my mule bucked off his pack and left my outfit scattered. Worst of all, my precious bundle made the mule top heavy coming down the place back here where the trail seems to drop off the earth. Then I was hard put to keep sight of my pack. Sometimes it was on top and other times the mule. But it got here at last, and now I'll open it." After this long and impressive harangue, which at least augmented the suspense of the women and worked the children into a frenzy, Jean leisurely untied the many knots round the bundle and unrolled it. He had packed that bundle for just such travel as it had sustained. 3 cloth-bound rifles he laid aside, with them a long, very heavy package tied between 2 thin, wide boards. From this came the metallic clink. "Oh, I know what them is," cried Lee, breaking the silence of suspense. Then Jean, tearing open a long flat parcel, spread out before the mute, rapt eyed youngsters such magnificent things as they had never dreamed of: picture books, mouth harps, dolls, a toy gun and a toy pistol, a wonderful whistle and a fox horn, and last of all a box of candy. Before these treasures on the floor, too magical to be touched at first, the two little boys and their sister simply knelt. That was a sweet, full moment for Jean, yet even that was clouded by the something which shadowed these innocent children fatefully born in a wild place at a wild time. Next Jean gave to his sister the present he had brought her: beautiful cloth for a dress, ribbons and a bit of lace, handkerchiefs and buttons and yards of linen, a sewing case and a whole box of spools of thread, a comb and brush and a mirror, and lastly a Spanish brooch inlaid with garnets. "There, Ann," said Jean, "I confess I asked a girl friend in Oregon to tell me some things my sister might like." Manifestly there was not much difference in girls. Ann seemed stunned by this munificence, and then awakening, she hugged Jean in a way that took his breath. She was not a child any more, that was certain. Aunt Mary turned knowing eyes upon Jean. "Reckon you couldn't have pleased Ann more. She's engaged, Jean, and where girls are in that state these things mean a heap. Ann, you'll be married in that." She pointed to the beautiful folds of material that Ann had spread out. "What's this?" demanded Jean. His sister's blushes were enough to convict her, and they were mightily becoming, too. "Here, Aunt Mary," went on Jean, "here's yours, and here's something for each of my new sisters." This distribution left the women as happy and occupied almost as the children. It left also another package, the last one in the bundle. Jean laid hold of it, and lifting it, he was about to speak when he sustained a little shock of memory. Quite distinctly he saw two little feet, with bare toes peeping out of worn-out moccasins, and then round, bare, symmetrical ankles that had been scratched by brush. Next he saw Ellen Jorth's passionate face as she looked when she had made the violent action so disconcerting to him. In this happy moment the memory seemed farther off than a few hours. It had crystallized. It annoyed while it drew him. As a result, he slowly laid this package aside and did not speak as he had intended to. "Dad, I reckon I didn't fetch a lot for you and the boys," continued Jean. "Some knives, some pipes and tobacco, and sure the guns." "Shore you're a regular Santa Claus, John," replied his father. "Well, well, look at the kids, and look at Mary, and for the land's sakes, look at Ann. Wow, well, I'm getting old. I'd forgotten the pretty stuff and gimcracks that mean so much to women. We're out of the world here. It's just as well you've lived apart from us, John, for coming back this way with all that stuff does us a lot of good. I can't say, son, how obliged I am. My mind has been set on the hard side of life, and it's sure good to forget, to see the smiles of the women and the joy of the kids." At this juncture a tall young man entered the open door. He looked a rider. All about him, even his face, except his eyes, seemed old, but his eyes were young, fine, soft, and dark. "How do you all?" he said, evenly. Ann rose from her knees. Then Jean did not need to be told who this newcomer was. "Jean, this is my friend, Andrew Colmor." Jean knew when he met Colmor's grip and the keen flash of his eyes that he was glad Ann had set her heart upon one of their kind. And his second impression was something akin to the one given him in the road by the admiring lad. Colmor's estimate of him must have been a monument built of Ann's eulogies. Jean's heart suffered misgivings. Could he live up to the character that somehow had forestalled his advent in Grass Valley? Surely life was measured differently here in the Tonto Basin. The children, bundling their treasures to their bosoms, were dragged off to bed in some remote part of the house, from which their laughter and voices came back with happy significance. Jean forthwith had an interested audience. How eagerly these lonely pioneer people listened to news of the outside world! Jean talked until he was hoarse. In their turn, his hearers told him much that had never found place in the few and short letters he had received since he had been left in Oregon. Not a word about sheepmen or any hint of rustlers. Jean marked the omission and thought all the more seriously of probabilities because nothing was said. Altogether, the evening was a happy reunion of a family of which all living members were there present. Jean grasped that this fact was one of significant satisfaction to his father. "Shore we're all goin' to live together heah," he declared. "I started this range. I call most of this valley mine. We'll run up a cabin for Ann soon as she says the word. An' you, Jean, where's your girl? I shore told you to fetch her." "Dad, I didn't have one," replied Jean. "Wal, I wish you had," returned the rancher. "You'll go courtin' one of these Tonto hussies that I might object to." "Why, father, there's not a girl in the valley Jean would look at twice," interposed Ann Isbel, with spirit. Jean laughed the matter aside, but he had an uneasy memory. Aunt Mary averred, after the manner of relatives, that Jean would play havoc among the women of the settlement, and Jean retorted that at least one member of the Isbels should hold out against folly and fight and love and marriage, the agents which had reduced the family to these few present. "I'll be the last Isbel to go under," he concluded. "Son, you're talkin' wisdom," said his father. "An' shore that reminds me of the uncle you're named after, Jean Isbel. Wal, he was my youngest brother, an' shore a fire eater. Our mother was a French Creole from Louisiana, an' Jean must have inherited some of his fighting nature from her. When the War of the Rebellion started, Jean and I enlisted. I was crippled before we even got to the front. But Jean went through 3 years before he was killed. His company had orders to fight to the last man. And Jean fought and lived long enough just to be that last man." At length Jean was left alone with his father. "Reckon you're used to bunking outdoors?" queried the rancher, rather abruptly. "Most of the time," replied Jean. "Wal, there's room in the house, but I want you to sleep out. Come, get your bedding and gun. I'll show you." They went outside on the porch, where Jean shouldered his roll of tarpaulin and blankets. His rifle, in its saddle sheath, leaned against the door. His father took it up and, half pulling it out, looked at it by the starlight. "44, huh? Wal, wal, there's shore no better, if a man can hold straight." At the moment a big gray dog trotted up to sniff at Jean. "An' here's your bunk mate, Shepp. He's part lofer, Jean. His mother was a favorite shepherd dog of mine. His father was a big timber wolf that took us 2 years to kill. Some bad wolf packs runnin' in this basin." The night was cold and still, darkly bright under moon and stars. The smell of hay seemed to mingle with that of cedar. Jean followed his father round the house and up a gentle slope of grass to the edge of the cedar line. Here several trees with low, sweeping, thick branches formed a dense, impenetrable shade. "Son, your Uncle Jean scouted for Liggett, one of the greatest rebels the South had," said the rancher. "An' you're goin' to be scout for the Isbels of Tonto. Reckon you'll find it 'most as hot as your uncle did. Spread your bed inside. You can see out, but no one can see you. Reckon there's been some queer happenin's round here lately. If Shepp could talk he'd shore have a lot to tell us. Bill an' Guy have been sleepin' out, trailin' strange horse tracks, an' all that. But shore whoever's been prowlin' around here was too sharp for them. Some bad, crafty, light steppin' woodsmen round here, Jean. 3 mornings ago, just after daylight, I stepped out the back door, and some one of these sneaks I'm talking about took a shot at me. Missed my head a quarter of an inch. To morrow I'll show you the bullet hole in the doorpost, and some of my gray hairs that are sticking in it." "Dad!" ejaculated Jean, with an outstretched hand. "That's awful. You frightened me." "No time to be scared," replied his father, calmly. "They shore is goin' to kill me. That's why I wanted you home in there with you. Now go to sleep. You shore can trust Shepp to wake you if he gets scent or sound. An' good night, my son. I'm sayin' that I'll rest easy to night." Jean mumbled a good night and stood watching his father's shining white head move away under the starlight. Then the tall dark form vanished, a door closed, and all was still. The dog Shepp licked Jean's hand. Jean felt grateful for that warm touch. For a moment he sat on his roll of bedding, his thought still locked on the shuddering revelation of his father's words. "They're shore going to kill me." The shock of inaction passed. Jean pushed his pack in the dark opening, and crawling inside, he unrolled it and made his bed. When at length he was comfortably settled for the night he breathed a long sigh of relief. What bliss to relax! A throbbing and burning of his muscles seemed to begin with his rest. The cool starlight night, the smell of cedar, the moan of wind, the silence, and were real to his senses. After long weeks of long, arduous travel he was home. The warmth of the welcome still lingered, but it seemed to have been pierced by an icy thrust. What lay before him? The shadow in the eyes of his aunt, in the younger, fresher eyes of his sister. Jean connected that with the meaning of his father's tragic words. Far past was the morning that had been so keen, the breaking of camp in the sunlit forest, the riding down the brown aisles under the pines, the music of bleating lambs that had called him not to pass by. Thought of Ellen Jorth recurred. He had met her only that morning. She was up in the forest asleep under the starlit pines. Who was she? What was her story? That savage fling of her skirt, her bitter speech and passionate flaming face, they haunted Jean. They were crystallizing into simpler memories, growing away from his bewilderment, and therefore at once sweeter and more doubtful. "Maybe she meant differently from what I thought," Jean soliloquized. Anyway, she was honest. Both shame and thrill possessed him at the recall of an insidious idea. Dare he go back and find her and give her the last package of gifts he had brought from the city? What might they mean to poor, ragged, untidy, beautiful Ellen Jorth? The idea grew on Jean. It could not be dispelled. He resisted stubbornly. It was bound to go to its fruition. Deep into his mind had sunk an impression of her need, a material need that brought spirit and pride to abasement. From one picture to another his memory wandered, from one speech and act of hers to another, choosing, selecting, casting aside, until clear and sharp as the stars shone the words, "Oh, I've been kissed before." That stung him now. By whom? Not by one man, but by several, by many, she had meant. Pshaw! He had only been sympathetic and drawn by a strange girl in the woods. Tomorrow he would forget. Work there was for him in Grass Valley, and he reverted uneasily to the remarks of his father until at last sleep claimed him. A cold nose against his cheek, a low whine, awakened Jean. The big dog Shepp was beside him, keen, wary, intense. The night appeared far advanced toward dawn. Far away a cock crowed. The near at hand one answered in clarion voice. "What is it, Shepp?" whispered Jean, and he sat up. The dog smelled or heard something suspicious to his nature, but whether man or animal Jean could not tell. Chapter 2 Part 2